Bruchim Habayim, welcome everyone. We're continuing on Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, the Halachot of Shabbat. Started Siman Resh. We're still in Seif Aleph of traveling through ship, boats on Shabbat. We spoke about the main elements of the dispute within the Gemara, what the reasons behind the prohibition, the Gezrat Rabbanan would be, and we mentioned that perhaps according to the Rith, the reason is as simple as Onek Shabbat, because a person that's going to be on a sea travel for the first 3 days, they are going to be uncomfortable, with getting seasick and so on and so forth, and hence you don't travel 3 days prior to Shabbat. And the question is, is Shabbat part of that? Is Shabbat not part of that? Now we are actually going to read through the Shulchan Aruch and try to cover the Mishna Beruras and the Sephardi poskim that talk about different psakim as well. Maran writes, "Mutar laflik b'sfina afilu be'erev Shabbat im holech ledar mitzvah." If you are going for a mitzvah, even on Friday you could travel by a boat. Uposek imo shishpot. You do make a tanai that he should stop, not work on Shabbat, even though that you know that he perhaps does not carry that through and he's not going to actually stop. That would be fine. En bekach klum. Shabbat, if you're going for a mundane reason, a personal trip, then it's going to be 3 days before Shabbat that you have to start. So Wednesday you could go, but not necessarily prior to that. The Chafetz Chaim writes, even though that if you go on Erev Shabbat, you for sure will not have Onek Shabbat, because it's like the first day, it's horrible. All the movements and seasick and throwing up and whatnot, so that's going to become a problem. But nevertheless, if you're going for a mitzvah, ha'osek b'mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. You're going li sorach mitzvah, that would be fine. The fact that you have to make up with the sailor, with the captain, that he should not travel on Shabbat, the Magen Avraham writes that the reason for that is on Shabbat is asur to travel by a boat, even ledvar mitzvah. So what's your heter on Shabbat? I understand Friday, but what's the heter on Shabbat? But lemaaseh, if you make the condition with him, even though that he doesn't listen, you will be fine. There are also those who hold that even on Shabbat, if you're doing it for a mitzvah, would be mutar. But lemaaseh, many of the Sephardi poskim, the Yad Aaron, others on Haggadah Tur, they write like the Magen Avraham, that will be asur on Shabbat as well. The Kaf HaChaim brings this debate. Ayin Sham. So says. What is for mitzvah? So we will discuss a little bit of sorech mitzvah as well. For sure, if you're going to a clear mitzvah, that would be a travel lesorach mitzvah. You're going to teach Torah. You're going to redeem a captive. Those for sure are a mitzvah. The question is, how about my sorach parnasah, my working for my livelihood? Is that considered a mitzvah to support my family, and so on? That becomes part of this question as well. It's not just a the sorach mitzvah is something that we discuss in the previous year as well, and those who want to argue that maybe even for some of the mundane activities will be considered sorach mitzvah. We're going to discuss this a little bit more when we get further in the Siman as well. Bezrat Hashem, says the Mishna Berura, pachot mishlosha yamim, this that he cannot travel less than 3 days, dehainu b'yom ravi b'shabbat asur. Already from a Wednesday would be asur. You remember the machloket that we discussed, is it Shabbat Friday, Thursday, or is it Friday, Thursday, Wednesday? What's 3 days before Shabbat? Is it 3 days before Shabbat, before beginning of Shabbat, or is it 3 days before Shabbat, including Shabbat? So Wednesday would be really the nafkamina. Hence, the Chafetz Chaim says we are going to be machmir that even on Yom Shvi, on Yom Revi'i rather, is asur. That's the Magen Avraham. But the Vilna Gaon is mekel. He brings many Rishonim who is clear from their writings that the 3 days is counting Shabbat as well. So Shabbat, Friday, Thursday, and hence Wednesday would be mutar. So on that, the Kaf HaChaim, he brings the fact that we discussed this last year, that because it is a machloket, one should try to be machmir as much as possible. And Chazon Obadiah, Chacham Obadia Yosef, he paskins like the Gra that because many Rishonim stand with that shita, mikara din, it will be fine, and you could travel on Friday even for a month, on Wednesday, starting on Wednesday, even for a mundane matter. Now, by the way, the Gra writes that from the Tosefta and the Yerushalmi, also you see the same thing as the Mishna Berura brings over here. And the same halacha would be for 3 days before Yom Tov as well, because you have a mitzvah of oneg Yom Tov as well. It's not just Shabbat. Now, the Rama writes, this was the Shulchan Aruch. Aval kodem shlosha yamim shari, but before 3 days, which would mean, based on what we're passing, on Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday, Sunday, it all is mutar, even with a sfila, afilu b'sfila shemoshchim ota al yedei be'emot, even if it's a smaller boat that animals are carrying it, they're directing it, still would be mutar. Afilu en bekova hamayim asarat tefachim, even if the water is not 10 tefachim deep, still would be mutar. Va'afilu b'makom sh'istarach Yisrael, even if it is a scenario in which the Jew who is riding the boat would need to do a melacha b'Shabbat afterwards. In other words, you're getting on a boat on Wednesday, on Tuesday, on Monday, Sunday, but you are traveling. You're going to be traveling for a while, and you know that comes Shabbat, you may need to be mechalel Shabbat in order to keep on traveling and keeping your life safe. Still will be mutar. So says the Chafetz Chaim, what does the chidush, the 3 different chidushim that the Ramah just mentioned? So one is, afilu b'sfina, even if it's a boat that is directed by animals, we know that if you have a horse and buggy, on Shabbat is asur to get on a horse and buggy, right? Even if you sat on the carriage before 3 days before Shabbat, comes Shabbat, you have to stop. You cannot do that, right? If you're traveling with a horse and buggy, and you started on Wednesday, does that mean that you can continue traveling on Shabbat? Absolutely not. So if you have a boat that the animals are pulling it, it's attached to ropes to animals on the side of the river. It just happens to be that instead of carriage, you're in a boat, right? You may have thought that this should be the same halacha as a horse and buggy, and says the Ramah, no, it's mutar. This case will be mutar. So says the Mishna Berura, even though that the water is very shallow, and you will have issue of tchumin, because if the water is very deep, then you don't have the issue of tchum Shabbat. The traveling a long distance would be out of the domain of Shabbat. Every person, when Shabbat kicks in, has a domain. And that domain cannot be transgressed. You cannot travel out of the domain. If you're in deep waters, so that domain is not there necessarily. If you have less than 10 tefachim height of water, that's considered like the ground level, basically. So you have the issue of techumin, of the domains. So it says, the Mishna Berura, the Hava Amina, the asur mishum tchumin. I would have thought it should be asur for tchum, kamash malan delo. That the halakha teaches us that it still doesn't have the issue of tchumin, and the reason for it is because you started from before 3 days before Shabbat, and that would save you from the issue of tchumin. Now, according to Shulchan Aruch in Seif Bet, we'll see Shulchan Aruch is going to paskin like the Rif, right? And according to the Rif, this would be actually a problem. This Rabbi Moshe Levi alav shalom in his Tshuvot Tfilah Moshe, he points this out, and we'll maybe get to it when we discuss Seif Bet. So this psak of the Mishna Berura, this is a specific psak that the tchumin would not be an issue, is something to be revisited according to the Sfaradi. Now, even if you know that in 3, 4, 5 days you're going to be Mechalel Shabbat when it comes time for Shabbat, even though that you're traveling from Tuesday, you know that comes Shabbat you have to work, still the Rama says it will be mutar. Why? Hatam, in the preface to this Siman, we mentioned that when you have 3 days before Shabbat, that's the concern that the person has. That's the time you start being concerned about Shabbat, to see to it that you're not Mechalel Shabbat. But before that, if you're on Tuesday, you're not obligated to think that I shouldn't do an action right now that's going to maybe bring me to do Chilul Shabbat on Shabbat. You're not mechuyav to think like that. You could get on a boat, and if the situation demands you to do Chilul Shabbat on Shabbat, you still could continue doing that from Tuesday, and when it comes to Shabbat, you deal with it. So if now I'm in Sakarat Nefashot and I have to do Mechalel Shabbat, be it. And that would be mutar. Within 3 days, you're obligated to see to it not to make decisions that will bring you to the Chilul Shabbat on Shabbat. But before that, you're less mindful of it halachically. You're not obligated to be mindful prior to that. Then you don't have an issue of Chilul Shabbat. Take a look later on in Seif Katan Chavav, says the Ramah now the Shulchan Aruch has an additional din ve'imhu derech mu'at kemo misor lesidon, if it's a short distance travel, like the cities of Sor and Sidon were very close. You got on a boat, a few hours, you got there within a day. So says the Shulchan Aruch, if you have a small travel like Sor to Sidon, then mutar laflik be'erev Shabbat. You could even travel on Erev Shabbat, but Boker, as long as you do it rise and shine early in the morning, you get there before Shabbat and you'll be good. But if you have a clear minhag in your place that you don't do that, then you're bound by the minhag. The Gemara in Masechet Pesachim Daf Nun, Sugya Bnei Bishan, discusses that if a community has accepted to themselves not to work on Erev Shabbat for kavod of Shabbat, even though halachically it was mutar to work on Erev Shabbat, but if they accepted it upon themselves, and that's the prevailing minhag, it is binding for them and for their children, right? One other sugya is when their fathers were rich and financially stable, and they had accepted upon themselves not to work on Erev Shabbat because they didn't need it necessarily, and they wanted to respect Shabbat. So their children were not as rich. Right? You know what happens to the children of rich people? Usually, tough times create strong people. Strong people create comfortable times. Comfortable times create weak people. Right? That's just how it is. So their kids came and said, "We're not rich as our fathers. Maybe we should be mutar for us to work on Friday." And Rabbi Yochanan says, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan told them, that your fathers already accepted this minhag, and it is binding for you guys as well. Hence this halacha over here in Shulchan Aruch. So says the Mishna Berura. Give me a moment. מפני שאפשר, רוצה לומר כשיש רוח טוב הולכים ביום אחד, even though that there is possibility that from Sor to Sidon also you won't make it until Shabbat hits, but if it is a good day, you could easily get there within the day before Shabbat hits, and therefore it will be mutar as long as the possibility is there that you will travel within the day and get to your destination on Friday afternoon. Sorry, what?
When does Erev Shabbat start?
Well, in the morning already. Friday morning. Friday early morning, yeah. Because no one travels at night, starting to travel at night. The Gemara says in Masechet Brachot, right? L'olam yetzeh adam bekitov, right? Yikanes bekitov. You want to make sure that your travel starts and ends during the daytime. That's one of the etzes the Chazal give us, not to travel during the night. Okay. Says the second Seif in Shulchan Aruch. Now here, Maran finally takes side within the three different shitas that we learned. Maran takes side over here, like the Rif, that the reason for not traveling 3 days prior to Shabbat is, like the Rif said, Oneg Shabbat. Because you travel, Oneg Shabbat is ruined, right? Try a sea travel. It's even with the cruises nowadays, you still get seasick. Now imagine the smaller boats, that the movements are much more radical, and you get in there, you have stomachache and headache and nausea and vomiting, and that's the first 3 days. That's what it is, right? Until you get used to it.
They have pills for that.
Sorry?
They have pills for that.
So that's the question, whether or not a person, this is a boat expert, of course, that's his commercial business, so it's probably part of what he sells. Putting a plug, but yeah, that becomes a question, whether or not if a person, you don't need to necessarily even ask that question. You could ask a question about a person that doesn't have the issue because he has traveled number of times in the past month or past year, and their body. And I'm not sure exactly what the limitations are, but once you do it a few times, your body gets used to it, and then at some point, you don't get sick every time you get on a travel. And it has limitation when the body adjusts to that. How often, I don't know, but that would be a valid question also. It doesn't seem to differentiate yet, but let's see. Says the Shulchan Aruch. That's because the first 3 days should call Shlosha Yamim Harishonim Yesh Lehem Tsar Ubilbul, because the first 3 days you always are in pain and you're confused and you have nausea, headaches, and so on. So hence the problem. Says the Shulchan Aruch. V'davka lemafligin beyamim hameluchim. That's only for Yamim hameluchim. It's not just the waves and the movements. Is also because of the odor and the steam that comes out of the sea. So therefore, it's only by Yamim Meluchim. It's only by regular salt water seas. But if you have Aval Bene'arot in the rivers, en shum sar. There's no real sar in the rivers. If you actually research this, you realize that it's actually very correct, because when you travel in the Na'arot, you don't have the same level of issues, and therefore says the Shulchan Aruch, לפיכך מותר להפליג בהם אפילו בערב שבת. Throughout the rivers, you could travel even on ערב שבת. ושלא יהיה ידוע לנו שאין בעומקן 10 טפחים, provided that you don't know that the depth is less than 10 tefachim. You remember, just 5 minutes ago we mentioned that Maran does not hold of this whole tchum leniency. Maran holds that if you know for sure that the water is shallower than 10 tefachim, then you've got issues of tchumin, serious issues of tchumin, and you cannot travel through the rivers that are less than 10 tefachim.
How wide is the
Every tefach, based on what we paskin, it is known as the machloket Rab Chaim Naeh, And the Chazon Ish, every tefach is 8 centimeters, according to the most opinions of the Rishonim and Achronim. So 10 would be 80 centimeters. According to Chazon Ish, would be 100 centimeters, exactly a meter, right? So it says the Shulchan Aruch, אבל במקום שידוע לנו שמקרקע הספינה לקרקע נהר פחות מ10 טפחים. This is, by the way, is not the depth of the water. It's the depth from the bottom of the ship or the boat to the bottom of the river. So the water is for sure more than 10 tfachim. When we talk about the depth of the water is from where you stand. Where you stand is the bottom of the ship, the bottom of the boat. That's where your unit is the boat. You're in the unit of the boat, so that's you, and you're standing on that height. So if from where you're standing, which is the bottom of the boat, until the bottom of the seabed or the riverbed, in this case, will be less than 10 tefachim, then you have an issue. Mishum isur tchumin, and that is because of the issue of tchumin, as we discussed before.
Yes, it's a very small boat. It's not likely to be less than.
Well, it depends on the river. Many rivers also you don't have a set depth to them. Different areas of the river have different depths. So it goes off the majority. That becomes a little more questionable. But nevertheless, on the rivers, sweet water that you could go on Erev Shabbat, you don't even have to do psika with the captain, with the sailors. Go on it, no problem. Now this that you can't know that's less than 10 tfachim, the kevan de tchumin de rabbanan, once you don't, if you don't know, it's mutar. Why is it mutar? If you don't know, maybe it is less than 10 tfachim. But because tchum, the isur of tchum here is the rabbanan, safek the rabbanan lekula. If you have doubt, you're allowed to rely on it, and you're good to go. This is very difficult to determine, by the way. You can't say, well, why don't you just measure it? If it would be measurable easily, then you don't rely on a safek, because the safek, the efshar lebaruri bekal, you could clarify your safek very easily, then you're obligated to do so. But here, you can't really easily measure it because you don't know the bottom of the boat. You have to measure the whole boat, and then the bottom, and how much is in the water, and then measure the water and subtract. It's a little more complicated than, and then if this is 10 tefachim, maybe next point it won't be. You have to have proper information about the river, and that's not something that's easily available and known by everyone. So therefore, also depends how much weight you put on your boat. Right? In other words, if you have a large boat and you put no weight on it, or it's one person in it, then it could be sitting at this level. And if you put another 5,000 pounds on it, then now it's another foot down. So there you have already, a foot is already, foot is what, 30, that's already, 4 tfachim, right? That's already 4 tfachim. So that could make all the difference. Whereas before you put the load on, it was 10 tefachim from the bottom of the thing to the sea, to the riverbed. Now it's not. So you see how this is complicated. So therefore, you're not obligated to clarify it. If you don't know, if you for sure know it's less than 10 tefachim, then it's asur. But if you don't know, it may be more than 10 tefachim, you're not mechuyav to go figure out. It's safek d'Rabbanan lekula. You could be mekel, it's fine. Says the Mishna Berura, even though the water itself has a depth of asara, we measure it from the bottom of the ship, as we mentioned already before. And the end of this Ramah says, if you know that's less than 10 tefachim, then it's asur because of tchumin. And says the Mishna Berura, that's, of course, within 3 days before Shabbat. That is, if you know that you will be still on the boat on Shabbat, and where you will be is going to have less depth than 10 tefachim, still will be asur. But if you're doing it before 3 days before Shabbat, from Wednesday or before, aval kodem lazeh mutar, then it's mutar. You don't have to concern yourself with what's going to happen on Shabbat. Maybe I'm not going to have a depth of 10. That's not something that you have to concern yourself 3 days before 3 days, which is Wednesday and before. So that's the second part of this Shulchan Aruch. We will, Be'ezrat Hashem, continue on the third part of this, which is still, we have a little bit left in the second Seif. We'll discuss that in Mitzvah Hashem in the days to come.